Wow, that's a really hard act to follow. What a great panel. Thanks very much. Um, I teach a course here that's kind of on the beginnings of various media forms, the book, telegraph, photograph, film. Those first few years when there are a lot of ideas, a lot of different technologies, tons of different ways and ideas of deploying this stuff. But after a few years, what you see is it's kind of whittled down to just a few things. And those strands there's usually power behind those strands. There's usually control behind those strands. And there's a lot of other possibilities that kind of wither away and pop up again with the next new medium. Presence, maybe even co-presence is one of those things that's toyed with, but pretty quickly gets shunted aside. I just want to give one or two examples from that and how it might relate to what's happening with VR. For example, in the 19th century, when the camera makes it to the world, and especially after the instantaneous photo is possible, so after, say, 1850, there's a crisis in the world of science about representation. Is the human eye and the human hand a better representor of what occurs when there's a splash of mercury or milk, or when we're looking at the brain ganglia and the presence or absence of synapses based on whatever they could see then? Is the human hand and eye a better apparatus to represent that, or the camera? The camera, after all, should be more objective. Huge crisis in the scientific community across the West about the alleged and assumed objectivity of the camera against what the eye sees. The eye imposes things like symmetry where there in fact is none. The eye imposes order where the camera finds chaos. And it's really interesting. That debate plays out for a good 40 years where the camera is systematically set aside in favor of the informed vision of the human agent. And it's uncanny to hear a lot of the debates about VR today and in terms of its, well, it can be ever more real. We can get it. It's the logic of the laser scans. This is accurate. This is indexicality. We might have doubted it with the photograph, but it's here for sure. And there's a lot to be said for that. But I think the real trick is to turn that question around and maybe think about how VR can help us to reflect on the limits of our own perception, or not the limits, the structures of our own perception, the ways in which we process the world around us. VR can be as a mirror, it's an incredibly interesting instrument to reflect on our own perceptual capacities. So, yeah, there's a really interesting, and it will remain a pitch debate about how real is real and how real can we get. But I think the really interesting one is to hold that thing up as a mirror. Another debate pops up, 1935, one of the very first texts written about television. Rudolf Arnheim writes a stunning little article on, the future of a new medium. And highly recommend looking it up and reading it. Perceptual psychologist, died at age 105, sharp till the end. It's an article that's uncanny because of how many of the things that he sort of worries about with this new medium have indeed remained worries you'd recognize them as worries today. One of his big fears with television is that people will mistake what they see for what they know. That think of how we know about most of the world. I don't know how many of you have been to I don't know where, deep in Latin America or Africa or wherever in the world. I, for one, have to say that much of my vision and sense of texture of these places and what life is like kind of seeps through those images that I can't really control. And I know better, but somehow as a fault, I do slip back to the sense that I know something when in fact I know nothing. I know nothing except the accumulated debris that's come to me in the form of highly filtered images. So I think this is something that becomes quite dangerous. It's back. That threat looms again with VR because we really do feel like we're there. And this raises lots of ethical questions that we've talked about. The whole issue of poverty tourism being a case in point. We can go there. We can have our 3 minutes of empathy. We can know and get back to what we're doing. So it strikes me that here the question is really, how can we exploit, how can we creatively tap that tension between being somewhere where we do feel, we have authentic human feelings, but absolute helplessness because we're like thousands of miles away and we're sitting in our living room in this brief moment. How can we exploit that tension? How can we take that tension and actually turn it into action? Turn it into something meaningful rather than just a 2-minute diversion and 2 seconds of sort of fretting about it until we get on to the me in the world. It strikes me that that tension has potential. I don't have any good suggestions about what to do with it, but tensions are always things that can be directed, and if we can give this an edge, if we can find ways to sort of do something with this, that would be an incredible power where otherwise we just have something that might not be. That said, I mean, I don't want to make it sound like we've learned all the lessons in the past and we need to sort of retrofit the past onto the present to see where we're going. A lot of things have changed. Yes, we're going to have the usual panic round. Yes, we're going to have the capitalization of this stuff and all the control scenarios. But we still have Moore's Law. It's still with us. This means that processing power is basically doubling every 2 years. That continues despite all the predictions that it's not going to. And that means that whatever technology we have right now in 2 years or in 4 years or in 5 years is going to really be different. So it's a moving target right now. Whatever we're saying, it's changing under our feet. That's a relatively new condition. One of the questioners mentioned the fact that these are products that go pretty much straight to the hands of the public, bypassing the usual heavy-duty filtration and shaping in the hands of industry. Again, a really interesting and new condition, and one that really introduces quite a new dynamic. Our media ecosystem over the last 15 years has gotten I mean, it's always been concentrated throughout the 20th century, but a concentration, let's say mid-century, where you had maybe 120 or 150 big media companies, we're talking today basically about 5. Controlling something like 80% of what's out there in terms of legacy media forms anyway, and social media forms. This is a really interesting condition, and on one hand, it's generated a lot of interesting stuff in terms of cross-platform work, but it's something we really need to think about when these technologies emerge. They're entering an ecosystem that is a profoundly different one from most of the historical precedents we have. So again, something really to think about. And finally, I think the condition with VR, whatever the claims of its immersion and 360 realism, the thing that is on the horizon with VR that makes it a really intriguing medium and quite a different one from any that we've had before is its ability to respond to the user. That ability to respond to where we're looking, to respond to our pupils, to sort of interact with us in a way that's kind of it's going to shift where the agency is in that particular dynamic, maybe even it out a bit. The machine will have as much agency as we do, whereas right now we're pretty much the agent in most interactive media settings, and certainly for the legacy stuff. These things are all potential game changers. They're going to really change the lessons of history and make us look at it all. The one thing that's come out today, and in a lot of the, not just today, but whenever you look at the discourse on VR, like it or hate it, for the moment, it has the power to attract. It has the power to bring viewers to topics they normally would avoid seeing, to bring viewers into worlds that they otherwise wouldn't know about. That ability to attract is, in all previous media, it's been a pretty dated commodity. It's got a shelf life of 5 to 7 years. Who knows what it will be with VR, but I think it means seize the moment, carpe diem, because we can do a lot with it right now. It's crucial. Brian Winston has written eloquently about what he calls the law of the suppression of radical potential. The law of the suppression of radical potential. That, media forms have incredible potentials that get beaten to a pulp and 1 or 2 things survive. That has not yet happened with VR. Seize the moment. It's rich, it's pluriform, tons of things are possible, and it really behooves us not to settle into orthodoxies or into genres or into technological fixes, but rather to keep exploding this thing, to keep it going, to find those radical potentials and make use of them. It's really crucial to develop critical literacies as this goes along, because if it just happens, it happens in a meaningless way. Critical literacy, both for production purposes and for reception purposes, is really, really important. Things like co-presence, things like embodied montage, new concepts, new ways of thinking are essential to this. So we have this moment. We've got to seize it. And I think we're virtually there in terms of drinks before we go there. Sarah, again, thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.